Piano Man, Part 3. Written and narrated by Dusty Thunder. As Adolf closed the door on any good left in him, a flame in his eyes was snuffed out. He felt a cold darkness win the battle. He was merely an instrument now, ready to play his part in the piracy of 10 more souls. His only remaining bother was that he still wouldn't be done after the group of 10 coming to Steinberg on Friday. He needed 2 more. If only there were 12, it would at least be over. To what end? He didn't know, but that didn't stop him from wanting it to be over. Mr. Becker said 10, but surely he would be there as well. Yesterday, Adolf would have been bothered by the thought of making Mr. Becker one of his victims, but today, he's saving his mother, and he's doing it by not caring anymore. If there is such a thing as a humanity switch, he had flipped his. Surely, Mr. Becker would be there. 11. He stood there in front of his closed door, staring into nothing, thinking. If Adolf was to have his piano set up and perform for the group, he would need help. Otto, his assistant at Steinberg, would likely be assigned to him for the day. That would be 12. Yes, that would do it. He would need to confirm that Mr. Becker would be there and arrange for Otto to be assigned to help him that day. 12 souls at one time. Adolf was satisfied with his plan and let his mind move to the next worry, the Alp. He looked around his cabin, unsure where to place himself. The chair? No, he had been stuck there far too long already. The piano bench? No. He didn't want to look at his piano until he absolutely had to. His cabin now felt like a prison cell, and for perhaps the first time in his life, he was desperate to get out. He looked out the window to the infinite wood. The light pulsed as the wind gently swayed the still half-barren trees. Single leaves fell in slow motion from above. Yes, a walk through the woods would be just the thing to accompany his meditation. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, looking up toward the sun, desperate to feel its warmth followed by the cool breeze on his face, but he couldn't. The gauze stole those from him. He was annoyed at the inconvenience, but quickly realized he only had himself to blame, or the Alp. He needed to think. He didn't have time for self-pity or to be annoyed by trivial things. He tugged his jacket tight, folding his arms and tucking his hands under them to keep them warm. And he set off on an aimless journey through the woods. His only destination was clarity. As he stepped through the crunching leaves, the beautiful scene around him faded away, overshadowed by the puzzle at hand, the Alp. It had his mother and was holding her soul hostage. The mare that had tortured him was one of the Alp's forms. What other forms had it assumed? What was its natural form? How long had it been torturing people in their slumber? And how many people had it imposed its will upon? How many souls had it fed on already? His mind raced through questions, each with no easy answer, no resource to reference, no one to ask more than a vague question of. Mr. Becker had been told stories as a young boy. Who else knew these stories? That was the end of the line for Adolf's train of thought. It didn't matter who else knew the stories about the Alp, because Adolf didn't speak to anyone. He didn't have friends. He had no one to confide in, nowhere to turn. Now that he was a killer, that was unlikely to change. He halted, frozen. He had been walking aimlessly, letting his mind and his steps wander, and they had both led him straight to Freda's grave. A lump formed in his chest and began to work its way up his throat. Perhaps it was the old Adolf crying for help, desperate to intervene in the pending plot to take 12 souls. He knew that lump climbing up his throat was all of the feelings he had swallowed just hours ago. Grief, sadness, regret, fear, loneliness, compassion, kindness, moral goodness. He couldn't let them spill out. He couldn't regress now. He had to save his mother. He recognized that his own soul was beyond saving now. He was damned for eternity, but his mother, he could save her, but only if he swallowed this lump once more. Only if he held down anything that might prevent him from accomplishing this mission. He had to be a monster. With his eyes still fixed on Freda's leaf-covered, unmarked grave, he swallowed the lump, sending old Adolf back down again. He set off in a new direction, away from Freda's grave, away from himself. The production floor at Steinberg was bustling like a well-oiled machine. Every corner of the factory was in motion, even Adolf's station. Otto was repairing the piano damaged in Adolf's incident the day before. He was leaning into the main cavity of the piano, inspecting the section of strings that Adolf's face had been pressed into. The strings were stained with blood, and one spot even had bits of skin left behind. Otto grimaced at this sight and wondered what to do with the strings. He saw Mr. Becker striding through the production floor briskly, clearly on a mission. "Mr. Becker, sir!" Otto raised his hand to catch Mr. Becker's attention as he flew by. Mr. Becker was moving so quickly that he barely saw Otto hail him. He was on his way to his office, where he needed to plan the extraction and travel of Adolf's piano from his cabin to Steinberg. This had better be important, he thought. "Yes, Otto." Mr. Becker reluctantly offered his attention. Otto motioned to the crime scene inside the piano. "The strings aren't broken, but..." Otto grimaced again at the sight. Mr. Becker looked inside the piano, examining the strings without giving away a facial reaction. After a few seconds, he stood tall and looked to Otto. "Replace the strings and anything else you find soiled," he said firmly. Otto nodded and turned around to grab supplies. Mr. Becker returned to his previously charted course, walking purposefully toward his office. While walking through the production floor, he looked around at the men, building a list of who he would recruit for a transport team. It would be a challenging journey. He needed strong men who could also take great care of precious cargo. He exited the production floor and walked into the office area, looking up to see Freda, turned around at her desk, examining something. He froze, overtaken by surprise. There was no hiding the puzzling thoughts racing through his mind, but they quickly faded. It didn't matter what had happened. She was here. "I thought we were going to have to form a search party," Mr. Becker announced to Freda in a half-joking, half-relieved tone. She sat straight, looking over her shoulder in his direction, then turned her chair toward him. It wasn't Freda. It was her sister, Agnes. She bore a striking resemblance to Freda. Her hair and build were identical, which is why Mr. Becker had mistaken her for Freda. Aside from her nose, they could be twins. Agnes was 2 years older than Freda, and ever since their parents had passed 13 years ago, Agnes had taken on a mother role to Freda. Mr. Becker hadn't seen Agnes since last year's Feiertag celebration at Steinberg, and that was typically the one time per year he would see her. Her eyes were swollen and red. She had clearly been crying, and she was visibly still upset. She held a handkerchief in her hand. Her bottom lip quivered. Her brow and eyes conveyed fear and doubt, but the rest of her demeanor held firm. A woman on a mission. Mr. Becker's heart sank. Something terrible must have happened to Freda. "Agnes?" His tone revealed his sunken heart. "What's happened? Where's Freda?" His face grew more concerned, and he approached Agnes to comfort her. She sobbed, turning her chair toward Mr. Becker as he walked beside the desk toward her, and looked up at him with glistening, puffy eyes. "I had hoped you would be able to tell me," she whispered through her tears, bringing her handkerchief to her eyes, then nose. Mr. Becker's face shifted to pure confusion. He sat on the corner of Freda's desk next to Agnes, perplexed. "I haven't seen her since last Friday," he confessed. "She went back to check on one of our builders who had missed work, and I assumed that she had gone home after." "Back?" Agnes inquired. "To see Adolf?" Mr. Becker nodded. Agnes looked down at the soiled handkerchief, fidgeting nervously as she recounted her last memories with her sister. "She told me she had visited his cabin on Thursday and left a note. She was terribly concerned about him," Agnes recounted. "We all were," Mr. Becker added. "It turns out that he had a minor illness. He came back to work on Monday." Agnes perked up, eager to chase down this lead. "Is he here now?" she asked eagerly. Mr. Becker shook his head, but his eyes revealed that there was more to the story. "When he came back on Monday, he had a terrible accident, marring his face. He's been home since then. I visited him just a few hours ago, and he's on the mend," Mr. Becker explained. Agnes began planning the journey to Adolf's in her mind, looking away from Mr. Becker and placing a hand to her chin, then looking back to him. Moving her hand from her chin to the arm of Freda's chair and pushing her back straight. "Where is Adolf's cabin?" Her eyes were determined now. Mr. Becker looked down with a jutted chin. I asked him if he had seen Freda last Friday. He delivered the words, still looking down, then raised his eyes to deliver the next words directly to her soul. He said she never came. Both of their heads dropped with a disappointed exhale. Agnes then remembered how Freda had spoken about Adolf over the years, not often, but enough for Agnes to be certain that Freda had said that Adolf does not speak. How did he say she never came when he does not speak? She looked to Mr. Becker's face, eager for an answer. Mr. Becker inhaled, raising his eyebrows and trying to find a way to deliver his response in a way that didn't make him seem crazy. He exhaled, lowering his brows to their default state as he realized there was no way to explain it other than just stating it plainly. He speaks now. He raised a single brow. Barely, but enough to answer my questions, he added, jutting his chin again to convey that this path is a dead end, and he's sorry for it. Agnes looked down and fidgeted with her handkerchief again for a few seconds, then looked back to Mr. Becker and reset her composure. I would still very much like to visit with him. Mr. Becker was fazed. His eyes widened slightly. Where is Adolf's cabin? She asked once more. Mr. Becker remained fazed for a long second, then stood up quickly and began walking back to the front side of the desk, stopping after 3 steps and looking over his shoulder toward Agnes. Come on, he lifted his chin. I'll take you to see him. A slow, almost smile formed on Agnes's face. She was surprised and thankful. She hadn't seen Freda since Friday morning, and she hadn't slept since then, speaking to anyone who may have seen her outside of Steinberg. This was the first glimmer of hope she had uncovered in her search, and Mr. Becker was the valiant knight going above and beyond for her, for Freda. This gesture solidified her understanding of the relationship and respect between Mr. Becker and Freda. He loved her in a way, not romantically, but as a father figure. He cared for her, and he, too, had been worried. She pushed herself out of Freda's chair and walked in step with him out of the office area, embarking on the journey to Adolf's cabin. On the carriage ride through and out of Heisenberg on the way to Adolf's cabin, Mr. Becker told Agnes everything he knew. He told her about Adolf's accident, how he had spoken, his piano, and the plan to showcase his piano on Friday. Agnes absorbed the information, asking follow-up questions for more details. By the time they reached the footpath to Adolf's cabin, Agnes had learned enough to believe that this would be a dead end. But she knew that Freda had visited his cabin on Thursday, if not also Friday, and she wanted to retrace her sister's footsteps. They were close, in sync. She thought seeing what Freda had seen might give her a clue, or maybe even lead her directly to Freda. Maybe she had fallen and was trapped somewhere. Maybe she was attacked. Wolves had been known to approach unsuspecting stragglers in these woods, but it had been years since she had heard of that. She didn't need to know what had happened. She just needed to find Freda. They walked slowly down the path, scanning for any sign of Freda. Adolf had been roaming the woods for hours. He had found the clarity he needed. He was now numb. His mind did not wander. His heart did not ache. His feet did not strain from the long walk. His face did not hurt. He did not feel anything. He trudged through the woods until his cabin appeared ahead. He planned to see his mother, to report to her that she would soon be safe. Soon, free? He was going to have all the souls that her captor required in 3 days' time. If he was to build up the strength this would require, he would need sleep, real sleep. Perhaps his plan would satisfy his mother or her captor, the Alp, if the stories were true, to allow him a night of real sleep. As he approached his cabin from behind, his eyes caught a glimpse of motion ahead. He focused on the area. It was the head of the path to the road, and 2 people were walking out of it, a man and a woman in a vivid blue coat. Adolf froze and evaluated his options. He could hide and wait them out. He had done it before. He couldn't run. If he could see them, they would soon see him, and the sound of the leaves would give his steps away. He leaned to the side and shielded his eyes to get a better look. It was Mr. Becker. Relief began to wash over Adolf's body until he got a better look at the woman. "Freda?" he gasped, his eyes shooting wide open as his body tensed. His heart raced. How was this possible? How? He had no plan for this. He had disabled all feelings, but panic would not be refused. panic was immune to control. Mr. Becker and Freda were approaching Adolf's cabin, and Adolf had to do something. He was supposed to be resting. He was supposed to be home. He had to answer, but how could he? How could he face Freda? How was she here? How could he not face her? How could he not see her up close, see that this is real? The choice became clear, and his panic transitioned into action. He looked toward the back door of his cabin, then to Mr. Becker and Freda, who had not yet seen him, then back to the door. He took giant, slow, quiet steps toward his door, careful to avoid the leaves, racing against them as they approached the front door. He arrived first, but he still had to get inside. He gently placed 2 fingers on the latch. Knock, knock, knock. He used the sound of Mr. Becker's knock to disguise the sound of his lifting the latch, and he quickly slithered inside, pushing the door back close and stepping toward the front door. As he stepped, he made sure to make his footsteps heard, a clear sign that he was right where he was supposed to be. He slipped his jacket off, threw it in the corner, and swung the front door open. There they were, Mr. Becker and not Freda, but almost Freda. Agnes was taken aback by Adolf's appearance. Fritz, Mr. Becker had insisted she call him by his first name, had warned her about his injuries and appearance, but it was still startling to look at. The look he was giving her may have unsettled her more than his appearance. His eyes were locked onto her and spread wide. He looked as if he was seeing a ghost. Mr. Becker interrupted the awkward silence with an apology and introduction. I'm so sorry, Adolf. I know you're supposed to be resting. This is Agnes, Freda's sister. She wanted to visit with you about Freda. Mr. Becker was tender with his tone. He had 2 fragile parties present and was determined to navigate these waters without creating any undesired additional turbulence. Adolf continued staring at Agnes. Agnes looked to Mr. Becker. Adolf. Mr. Becker tried to reach Adolf in his lost depths. Adolf came to, realizing that he had been rudely staring. He blinked the dryness of his eyes and shook the webs of his mind away, then looked to Mr. Becker and nodded, motioning for them to come inside. Mr. Becker and Agnes stepped into Adolf's tiny cabin, keeping their coats on as Adolf closed the door behind them. Agnes entered first, her eyes drawn to the infamous piano Mr. Becker had described. His description hadn't done the piano justice. She turned from the piano toward Mr. Becker and raised an eyebrow. Mr. Becker delivered the same "I told you so" look that he had given the doctor when he first laid eyes on the piano. Adolf awkwardly shuffled across the room to fetch the single chair. He slid it behind Agnes and motioned for her to have a seat. She turned to look at the chair and then toward his gauze-covered face. Thank you, she replied, lowering herself into the chair. Won't you have a seat as well? Adolf nervously looked around his tiny cabin and turned his hands upward, signaling surrender. Agnes looked toward the piano bench and tilted her head, offering the bench as a suggestion. Adolf looked to Mr. Becker. Please, Adolf, sit, Mr. Becker injected. You should be resting anyway. Adolf reluctantly pulled the piano bench out at an angle and sat on the end of it, facing Agnes. As he got seated, he looked slowly from the ground up to Agnes. She was so much like Freda, the way she dressed, her hair, her eyes, and there she sat, in the chair that Freda had sat in, died in. He was replaying the scene in his mind, but his emotional blockade prevented him from truly reliving it. The old Adolf, deep down inside of him, was screaming. I understand that my sister dropped by your cabin on Thursday, but you didn't see her. Agnes began her official interview by establishing a mutual understanding of the facts. Adolf nodded. Did she leave you a note? She asked, maintaining eye contact with him. Adolf paused, then nodded again. May I see it? She requested with a hint of desperation. Adolf slowly pushed himself up and walked over to the corner where he kept his tools and lifted the note from underneath a bag. Touching the paper replayed even more scenes in his mind, but he resisted. He turned back toward Agnes with the note and approached her, stretching his arm to hand her the note. Thank you. She gently reached out and accepted it, studying it intently as Adolf shuffled back to his seat on the piano bench. As she finished reading the note, she looked back to Adolf. She admired you, she confessed, and more than she said here. She held up the note to reference Freda's words about admiring Adolf's dedication and passion. She spoke of you several times over the years. Adolf looked at the floor in discomfort. She used to listen to you play during lunch. Agnes continued. Adolf looked back to Agnes. They held a gaze for several seconds. Agnes searched his eyes for any sign of information he may be holding back, and he was determined to hide his guilt and keep old Adolf at bay. I told Agnes that you didn't see Freda last Friday, just like you told me. Mr. Becker again played the role of breaker of awkward silence. They both glanced at him, then back to each other. Agnes's face now pled with Adolf. She tilted her head slightly to the right and down, letting her dark hair hang in front of her right eye before bringing her eyes up to him. You haven't noticed anything out of the ordinary, have you? Another note, perhaps? Strange noises? Wolves? She sought any crumb of information. Adolf's eyes pushed to the side as he pretended to scan his memory, shaking his head until an idea struck him. Wolves, he muttered. Agnes perked up. Mr. Becker did as well, stepping closer to Adolf. Wolves? When was this? Mr. Becker followed up. Friday, Adolf responded. Agnes slowly closed her eyes and exhaled. She feared the worst, but she also felt a small sense of relief because she might actually be able to find out what happened to her sister. Do you hear wolves often out here? Mr. Becker sought more context, understanding that wolves were common in these woods and also that Agnes may be attaching to this theory too quickly. Agnes opened her eyes after Mr. Becker's question and looked to Adolf. Adolf nodded, and Agnes deflated, recognizing that her needle was now lost to the haystack once again. Speaking of wolves, Mr. Becker interjected. It will be dusk soon. We should be on our way back, Agnes. He stretched out his arm and offered his hand to her. She looked at him and reluctantly nodded, accepting his hand and pulling herself upright. Thank you, Adolf. She spoke gently as she fought back tears. I'm worried for my sister. Please do tell me if you remember anything or see anything. Adolf stood from the piano bench and nodded, then stepped toward the door and opened it for them. Agnes walked through the doorway as Mr. Becker followed. Oh, Mr. Becker stopped suddenly and placed a hand on the door to prevent it from closing before he could speak the words he had just remembered. I'll have a team clearing your path first thing in the morning so we can get the cargo carriage down it, and I'll be with a second team working on cutting a hole to get it out of your cabin. Mr. Becker was back to talking business and did so quietly to not detract from Agnes's search for Freda. Adolf nodded in understanding. Mr. Becker tipped his hat and walked quickly to catch up to Agnes. The two of them strode down the wooded path back to the road. Adolf watched as they passed behind tree after tree, catching short glimpses of what still looked like Freda walking right there with Mr. Becker until they were fully engulfed in the woods. He slowly closed the door and looked to the ground. He had succeeded in hiding his guilt. He had evaded certain disaster. His plan was still in motion. He was tired. From the walk, but more so from this charade. He needed to sleep. And he remembered that he planned to inform his mother of his plan in hopes that it would buy him some actual rest. He turned away from the door, ready to assume his sleeping position under the piano again, but something caught his eye. There, on the chair, was Freda's note. Agnes had set it down when she stood to leave. Adolf cautiously approached it, leaning down and gently lifting it from the chair seat. He scanned Freda's words again, but he didn't know why. It must have been old Adolf clawing for a few seconds of sight. Feeling nothing after looking at the note, he walked towards his piano, lowered himself to his knees, and crawled under the piano to his makeshift bed. He laid his head on the balled-up canvas and closed his eyes, not even realizing that he still held Freda's note in his hands. Adolf's eyes shot open as a fierce whinny echoed for an eternity. His face was on the ground of the dark void again, but this time he saw something a few meters from him. He couldn't make it out at first, but as it drew nearer, he saw that it was his mother's shoes. "What's this?" she asked, standing over him as he lay on the ground. He turned his head up toward her, confused at the question. She wasn't looking at his face, but something further down his body. Adolf began to push himself up to a sitting position, and as he brought his right hand in front of him to brace himself, he felt something between his fingers. He brought his hand to his face, bracing himself with his left hand in a half-sitting, half-laying position. It was Freda's note. His brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this, Adolf?" His mother pressured him for an explanation with a hint of panic. He sheepishly looked up toward her, then climbed to his feet and held the note out to her like a young student caught passing a note in class. She swiftly grabbed the note and scanned it, then looked at him with a facade of compassion. Adolf, we've talked about this. It was necessary, his mother pled, begging him not to regress. Adolf nodded. I know, he responded, holding up his arm to disarm her panic. 12 people. Friday. He hoped she could piece together his plan from these few words. Luckily, his mother was always his best interpreter. A massive smile of pride and excitement took over her face. I'm so proud of you, Adolf. She grabbed his hands and then noticed that Freda's note was still in her hand. She tore it up, letting the pieces float to the ground of the void, then resumed grabbing his hands and looking him in the eyes. Soon we'll both be safe, she whispered. Adolf nodded. I need sleep, strength, he pleaded. Still holding his hand, she looked to her left, then to her right, seemingly checking for permission from her captor, then looked back to Adolf. Of course, dear, she responded. You'll need your strength for that many souls at once. Adolf's mouth formed a slight smile, pleased that his request was granted. I plan to see you Thursday night. Until then, you'll be able to get some real rest, she furthered with a smile. Adolf nodded in understanding. She pulled him forward and embraced him tightly. He was caught off guard and hesitated to return her embrace, eventually caving. He held her tightly and buried his face in her shoulder with closed eyes. As they held each other, he felt something odd, tickling his nose. He opened his eyes slightly to see what could be creating this feeling. It was her cloak, the cloak that she had only worn in this void, that he had never seen her wear before this place. He tried to study it, to get a closer look, but the bright light appeared on the horizon, and with a whoosh, he was back under his piano. His arms were still positioned in the embrace. The note was gone. He looked around for it, sure that it must be nearby. Nothing had ever traveled with him to that place, let alone stay behind without him. That couldn't be right. If that were true, could he get stuck there? Could he bring other things in? People? And could it be possible that he could bring someone out? Could he free his mother? His mind was now spun with possibilities, unable to think about anything else. Everything else faded away in his mind. The upcoming event, Mr. Becker, Agnes, Freda, the note, the early morning and busy day ahead, and even the cloak that just moments ago tickled his nose, all faded to nothing. Could he free his mother? That's all that mattered now. He let his body relax as his mind leaped into battle with this possibility, and the need for true sleep, true rest, claimed him. His eyes faded with the flicker of his eyelids as gravity set in. Finally, for the first time in at least 5 days, he truly slept. Mr. Becker was pounding at Adolf's door with frustrated urgency. Adolf, startled at the clatter, scurried and pulled the door open. Oh, thank goodness, Mr. Becker exhaled. I was starting to think something had happened to you. He turned around and alerted his team. Adolf was as dazed as a bear coming out of hibernation. Mr. Becker had apparently been rapping at the door for a good while, and meanwhile, 5 men stood behind him with tools and a mission. Adolf was holding up jobs. So sorry, Adolf pled. Mr. Becker quickly looked back to Adolf, realizing that he may have taken his words more harshly than intended. His face showed a caring concern. Oh, no, Adolf, he explained. We're fine. I was worried about you. Adolf understood and nodded. He stepped back and let the door swing open, triggering a flurry of commotion. The team flooded into Adolf's cabin, looking at the piano and the wall, taking measurements and planning their cuts. It was business now. Adolf quickly realized that his cabin wasn't suited to hosting parties, and he stepped outside to relieve the discomfort of being close to people. Mr. Becker was still outside. I thought you might find your way out here. Mr. Becker smiled. Adolf nodded in surrender and rubbed his arms. It was cold. His breath billowed steam under his nose. Mr. Becker noticed his discomfort. Otto, Mr. Becker barked. Run Adolf's jacket to him, please. Otto, Adolf's assistant at Steinberg, was part of the crew in his cabin. He rushed out with Adolf's jacket and handed it to him. Adolf accepted and nodded thanks to Otto, who was already on his way back inside. Big day, Mr. Becker smiled. Adolf started putting on his jacket and stepping closer to Mr. Becker. The team on the path has 25 men clearing and leveling its way here. Mr. Becker looked toward the path at the noise echoing their way from the distance. The sounds of shouted orders, brush falling, and axes colliding with their target. Adolf looked impressed. Precious cargo, Mr. Becker said in a genuine and thankful tone. Adolf was flattered and looked to the ground. Oh, I brought you something. Mr. Becker's demeanor shifted to excitement as he reached into his coat and pulled out a small book. Its cover simply had the word Albtraum, nightmare, embossed on its dark green surface. He stretched out his hand, holding the book to Adolf. Adolf reached out and slowly accepted. It's going to be a long day of waiting, Mr. Becker revealed. I thought you might enjoy your time more with this. He motioned to the book with a smile. Adolf opened the book, realizing what this was. This was a book about the nightmare, the mare, the Alp, the stories that might help him free his mother. He wanted to frantically explore it, but he knew that his reactions to the stories would be odd to Mr. Becker. He couldn't take this journey in Mr. Becker's presence. If you don't mind, Mr. Becker interjected, seeing that Adolf was eager to dive into the book, I would like to build you a fire over here and set up your chair. You won't want to go back inside for a while. He rubbed his hands together and lifted them to his mouth to warmly blow into them. This was also an exclamation point to his offer, driving home to Adolf that a fire would be a good idea for everyone. Adolf nodded without hesitation. He was indeed cold, and he had only been outside for a few minutes. Mr. Becker's offer to set up a warm fire and a seat for him to focus on his book was everything he could have hoped for. He was in his own world, cozied up near the fire in his chair with a blanket, a mug of coffee, and his book, all provided by Mr. Fritz Becker. The world around Adolf buzzed with activity. Inside his cabin, his piano had been covered for protection, and an orchestra of axes and saws sang in a fluid rhythm, cutting away at the left wall of his cabin, making their way down markings that drew a rectangle 3 meters long and 2 meters tall. A much larger orchestra of axes, saws, horses, and men drew closer to the cabin every minute down the path. Adolf was oblivious to everything, locked into his book and his side quest to rescue his mother. He was particularly unaware that alongside the path-clearing team was another team, a search party. Agnes had recruited 4 friends to join her on a search for any sign of Freda, starting with the woods alongside the path. These friends, 2 young couples, knew Freda well, and when Agnes confided in them about wolves in these woods being the current likely scenario, they didn't hesitate to join her search. The 5 scoured the leaves and horizon alongside the path-clearing team, an unofficial alliance strategically formed by Agnes. She had overheard Mr. Becker telling Adolf about the path-clearing team, and she knew that if her search did uncover something, she may need the kind of help that 25 strong men could provide. She had not arranged with Mr. Becker to enlist his men if this possibility was to become a reality. Instead, she took a calculated risk, betting on her faith in Mr. Becker's character and fatherly love for her sister. She was sharp, a trait that she shared with her sister. The path-clearing process was a work of art. Men cleared brush in front. Behind them, more men shoveled away peaks and filled valleys. Behind them, more men smoothed the loose dirt. Behind them, one man, the team elder, advanced the cargo carriage inch by inch. The men moved like a clock's gears. They knew their race against time and the importance of the cargo returning on this path. A single, unsoftened bump in this path could be catastrophic to the piano and their livelihood. Agnes was determined to find something, anything. She wasn't sure that she would find her sister in these woods, but she was closer to sure than she's been about anything else to this point. This was her only lead. She needed to find something. Her search party had only been searching for an hour, but had found no sign of Freda yet. They advanced step by step closer to Adolf's cabin, flanking the path-clearing team, clinging to hope. Adolf was enthralled by the stories in Albtraum. It was a collection of lore and other traces of the Alp throughout history. A typical German proverb simply says, "The elf deceives me." In the 13th century, Heinrich von Moringen's 5th love song starts with, "Full many a man is bewitched by elves, thus I too am bewitched by great love." Later, prayers were common to ward off the Alps' demonic threats. Münchener Natzing reads, "Elf, you shall remain no longer. Elf's sister and father, you shall go out over the gate. Elf's mother, true and mare, you shall go out to the roof ridge. Let the mare not oppress me, let the trute not pinch me, let the mare not ride me, let the mare not mount me. Elf with your crooked nose, I forbid you to blow on the following people. The Alp would sit on a sleeping person's chest, eventually causing them to startle awake with gasping terror, unable to move under its weight. They could be summoned and controlled by witches. Some believed they would ward off Alps with broomsticks under pillows, horseshoes, a mirror on the chest, and even crosses. Adolf was learning so much, and while he struggled with his ignorance of this apparently common story, he knew that his upbringing was atypical, and nothing that he had learned yet would help him free his mother. The next page displayed a crude illustration based on a painting by Johann Heinrich Füssli called The Nightmare. It made Adolf's heart sink. There stood the mare he had faced, whom he had dreaded, and an odd creature about half the size of a human, with pointy ears and a smile made from pure evil, sitting on a sleeping woman's chest. At least based on what Adolf had read so far, he assumed she was asleep. She looked closer to death than sleeping, and the Alp looked proud of its work, in its original elf demon and mare forms. Adolf was frozen, but a word on the opposing page caught his eye. Cloak. He quickly abandoned the pit in his stomach that seeing the Alp and mare had caused, and he poured his focus into the page that discussed the cloak. He learned that the Alp wears a cloak of invisibility, giving it the ability to shapeshift and turn invisible. He was confused. Mr. Becker had told him that the Alp was a shapeshifter, but the cloak couldn't be the source of that power. If it were, then his mother would have that power as well. Or, it can't be, he thought, knowing in his bones that it was true but not allowing his mind to accept it. The cloak his mother wore was only worn by the Alp. He closed his eyes in utter defeat. Old Adolf reemerged, flooded with emotion. He remembered the thoughts and feelings that he had experienced when he confronted his mother immediately after taking Freda's life. He remembered thinking, "This is not the woman I remember," and feeling nothing but contempt for this thing that sullied her memory by wearing her likeness. He remembered how fleeting those thoughts and feelings were. They quickly disappeared when he learned that his mother was in danger as well. He froze in realization that the danger she was suddenly in was a ruse, a reaction to his getting too close to the truth. And it worked. He was disgusted by his weakness. He was the fool, swayed with minimal effort, a puppet controlled by a demon. He was preparing to take 12 more lives for his mother, for this Alp. He was embarrassed. He was angry, but more than anything, he was unsure. If he had learned anything at this point in his journey, it was that he knew nothing. He had grown untrusting of his feelings, of his mind, and so he felt that this was damning evidence, but he had not fully accepted it. He stared into the flames, lost in the riddle that his mind had become. Where do you go when you don't know where to go? He asked himself. Forward, he answered. Adolf's mission was to illuminate a path using the words within these pages. He had already uncovered a potentially pivotal theory. What else would he find? As the world continued buzzing around him, his oblivious gaze into the flames, his cabin being cut open, the path being halfway cleared, and the search for Freda continuing, he looked back to his book, hoping to find more answers inside, resuming his search. It was dark. A muted whinny sounded off, and suddenly, a great curtain fell. As it fell, it flooded the tiny cabin with light, revealing a great pile of canvas. The wall of Adolf's cabin fell with a mighty thud, and the men who had enlisted the help of a horse to pull it down dropped their ropes in victory. The saws were set aside. The mission was now to extract the piano through the fresh opening, but this was a milestone that the men deserved to celebrate. Mr. Becker smiled as he rewarded the men with rest and walked toward the path, heading to check in on the path-clearing team. He saw Adolf by the fire, lost in the book he had brought him, and kept his distance. He didn't want to interrupt, and he had work to do. He would be ready for the cargo carriage shortly, and he needed to find out how long they would be, so he disappeared into the trail's camouflage. As Mr. Becker grew closer to the sounds of progress that echoed from the path-clearing team, he was pleased that they were on schedule. This was an uncommon challenge, and his plans were executed like clockwork. He was proud of his men. He was also proud of his plans. He scanned the trail ahead to bring their progress into focus when something in his peripheral caught his eye. It was a bright blue color, much too vibrant to be worn by one of his men. He couldn't make it out at first, but as he walked further into the path, the blue drew nearer to him. Eventually, he could see that it was a person, a woman, and then finally, he could see that it was Agnes. What in the world? He wondered aloud. He then saw another person further into the woods, walking parallel to Agnes, then another even further into the woods. He could see the path-clearing team ahead, working away, but he couldn't focus on them. What were Agnes and these people doing walking through the woods? Then he realized exactly what they were doing. They were looking for Freda. He was overridden by guilt. Here he was, moving heaven and earth to bring a piano from Adolf's cabin to Steinberg, and he should be looking for Freda too. The captain in him knew that he had to complete his mission for the company, but his heart ached with regret and shame. He felt awful. Mr. Becker was the kind of man who didn't want to feel awful, and when he did, he took swift action to resolve that feeling. He stepped toward Agnes, walking off the path and into the woods. Agnes and her search party had been looking for hours and found nothing. She didn't know what to expect and was trying not to get disappointed quickly. She tried not to expect a miracle, but a growing part desperately needed one. It was beginning to show on her face. The cold brought tears anyway, but her brow and mouth showed stern focus mixed with worry. She heard something through the loud commotion of the path-clearing crew. The sound of steps and leaves coming toward her. She swung her head toward the sound to see Mr. Becker approaching her, much closer than expected. It startled her. "I'm so sorry," Mr. Becker announced, raising his hands to show no harm. "The noise from the path must have made my calls difficult to hear." She raised a hand to the chest of her vibrant blue coat, telling her heart that it could slow down now. "Mr. Becker," Agnes said, sweetly greeting him. "Anything?" he asked with a look of cautious hope. Agnes shook her head and looked to the ground. Mr. Becker exhaled in disappointment. "It's a lot of ground to cover," he said while looking into the vast woods around them. "When my team is done, I'll have them join you." He was intent to help, and not just because he felt awful. He cared for Freda. Agnes looked up at him in shock of his generosity, forming the best smile that looming grief can shine through. Her eyes glistened with gratitude, and she nodded. "Tomorrow as well, if needed," he added. She hadn't thought past today. Perhaps it was the growing piece of her that believed in miracles, that ignored the possibility of not finding anything today. Tomorrow did not exist for her until this moment. Would she keep searching as long as it took until something was discovered? Absolutely. She would search until she could no longer walk from old age, and after she was gone, she would come back in spirit and wander these woods for eternity until she found Freda. This was the only path with promise. She would not abandon it, no matter how cruel the journey may become. "Thank you," she responded with a resolute tone. She was now a soldier on a mission. She would not quit, and she needed all the help she could get. Mr. Becker tipped his hat to Agnes, turned around, and resumed his trek to the path-clearing team. In the other direction, a smoky haze filled the sky above the trees near Adolf's cabin. Adolf was still seated near the fire, glued to the book. He was quickly scanning pages now, realizing that he didn't have time to entertain any information that wasn't going to aid in clarifying his quandary. The information about the cloak presented a strong possibility that his mother was the Alp. Rather, the Alp was assuming the likeness of his mother. He still wasn't completely convinced, so he quickly searched the book's pages, hoping to dispel or confirm this theory. As he turned another page, nearly 3/4 of the way through the book, he saw an image of an eye. The eye appeared to be damaged, as if layers of the iris had been eaten away in several spots. He froze. His gaze locked onto this drawing of the damaged eye. He had seen this eye before. It was his mother's eye. Not the mother that he remembers from life, but the mother who had appeared to him in the darkness, who had convinced him to take Freda's life, convinced him that her soul was in danger and that the only way to free her was by taking 12 more souls. Underneath the eye's image in the book, the description read, The Alp's evil eye. He slowly inhaled the gravity of this finding, closed his eyes, and let his head fall back. The cloak, the evil eye, they belonged to the Alp, not to his mother. His mother was gone, and any comfort that he had felt by seeing her in the darkness was fabricated, nothing more than a memory's evil shadow. His mother wasn't in danger because this wasn't her. Adolf didn't need to take 12 more souls because this wasn't her. But the Alp would haunt him forever unless he followed through. He would never be able to sleep again if he refused this mission. He would be tormented forever, imprisoned by a demon who had tortured enough people already to have a compilation created for reference. He felt trapped by circumstance, but he returned to the book, opening his eyes and lowering his head back into the pages. One can render the Alp powerless by removing its evil eye, he read. Then played the potential scenarios in his mind. He only encountered the Alp in the void, surrounded by literal nothing. How could he possibly find the means to remove the Alp's eye? He returned to the book again, eager to uncover a guide to the impossible task of removing the eye, but the book left him wanting. It didn't tell him how to remove the eye, only that doing so would render the Alp powerless. He turned the book over on his lap, frustrated. He had finally learned the truth and stumbled upon a way to break the Alp's control over him, only to have no way to achieve this feat feasibly. He imagined digging his fingers into her eye socket and plucking the eye with his bare hands. Knowing that it was the Alp and not his mother did little to remove the scarring image of seeing his mother eyeless and bleeding. Could he do it? Could he become a monster himself to defeat the monster that tortured him? Whose still gauze-covered face tilted upward while the book laid face down on his lap. As Mr. Becker drew nearer, he thought Adolf might be asleep. He focused on Adolf's eyes as he continued his approach. If Adolf were asleep, he wouldn't bother him, but he wasn't sure how anyone could sleep with the noise of today's mission. Adolf wasn't asleep, of course. He was lost in thought, trying to figure out how to remove the Alp's eye and break its control over his life. Mr. Becker saw his eyes open and staring off into the distance. Mr. Becker looked into the woods in the direction Adolf's eyes indicated, and he saw nothing but trees slowly discarding their leaves to the ground. He looked back to Adolf, thinking he might be asleep with his eyes open. "Adolf," Mr. Becker softly announced. Adolf did not respond. He just kept staring at nothing. "Adolf," Mr. Becker softly repeated. Adolf repeated his response of no response. Absolute stillness. He could have been a statue. He could have died right there in the most picturesque of ways to go. He didn't even appear to be breathing. He's not breathing, Mr. Becker thought in a tone of panic. His face now shifted from caution to concern, and he now had to abandon his previous approach of subtlety. "Adolf!" Mr. Becker now spoke slightly more alertly than a normal conversational level. Adolf startled, nearly out of his chair, catching himself only by the grace of Mr. Becker's outstretched hand. He looked up at Mr. Becker and touched his chest to curb their panic. He shook his head in disappointment at himself, and Mr. Becker helped him return to his seat. No, Adolf, I'm sorry," Mr. Becker said. "I thought you were—" Adolf looked at Mr. Becker in surprise, which transitioned to understanding as he realized that he had been staring off into space. He held up the book and motioned to it, then to his head and chuckled at himself. Mr. Becker understood. "Yes, well, I'm sorry for startling you," Mr. Becker continued, "but I wanted to talk to you about coming back to Steinberg with me, and your piano." He looked to Mr. Becker, awaiting the imminent ask. "I would like you to accompany the piano during transport every step of the way. It is your masterpiece, after all," Mr. Becker explained. Adolf expected this much and nodded in agreement. "One more thing," Mr. Becker continued. "I would like you to stay at my home tonight." An awkward silence filled the air. The previously clattering noise, the sound of progress, faded to a nearly undetectable level. Adolf looked toward his cabin. He hadn't thought this far ahead, but he certainly couldn't stay in his cabin tonight with it being torn apart. He would, but he wasn't lying about seeing wolves in these woods, not near his cabin, but he understood that he needed to portray them as a major threat because of Freda, because of Agnes. He looked to the ground and thought, then back to Mr. Becker and shook his head, declining his offer. After several seconds of confusion from Mr. Becker, He opened his mouth to object, but before he could make a sound, Adolf spoke. Under piano, he said softly but firmly, pointing toward the cabin. Mr. Becker followed the point and saw the piano visible through his open cabin door, waiting to be extracted and loaded into a wagon. He couldn't see it from where they stood, but he knew it was the spot on the floor where Adolf had slept for ages. He formed a half smile, looked to the ground, and he chuckled. Adolf wanted to stay with his piano. Mr. Becker admired his dedication to it. He looked back up to Adolf and nodded. Of course, he responded. We'll make sure you're comfortable. And with that, Mr. Becker launched his determined gait toward the cabin, toward the extraction team, ready to put them into action. Soon, Adolf's piano would be loaded onto the cargo carriage, and the journey to Steinberg would begin. Adolf watched him walk away with admiration, and then he looked down at his book and he remembered all of his woes. That man, walking away, was a good man. He shouldn't die. Only Adolf could save him from the Alp, his mother, his piano, and him. He must solve this. He must figure out a way to remove the Alp's evil eye. It's madness, he thought. But then he thought about everything else happening in his life, and he realized that this was no more mad than any of those things, and his brow pointed from worry to determination. It was now late in the afternoon. The path-clearing team had successfully paved the way for the cargo carriage to reach Adolf's cabin and smoothly deliver the piano to Steinberg. The extraction team had successfully removed the piano from the cabin, and both teams came together to load it onto the carriage with great care. Inside the giant cargo box, Adolf's piano was covered in blankets, canvas tarps, and rope that secured it to the carriage in every direction. Most men had accomplished their missions and prepared to disband when Mr. Becker called for their attention. Excellent work today, men, Mr. Becker proudly hailed. The transport team will head back with the carriage. Everyone else, please join the search party on the path. Mr. Becker motioned to the path while several men looked at each other with confusion. You all know Freda, he still projected, but now with a solemn tone. Standing at the back of the cargo carriage, Adolf stared at the engineering marvel that held it in place, froze, and every hair on his body stood on end at hearing her name. She has been missing for nearly a week, and her sister, Agnes, is leading the search party. His tone began transitioning to that of a general asking his men to march into battle. Adolf slowly approached the crowd to get a better view of the scene, afraid of what he might hear. This was the first he had heard of a search party. Wolves in these woods might have taken her. Mr. Becker spoke about the wolves as if they were the enemy. Or she could have gotten lost, injured. She may be alive, waiting for someone to find her. Confusion was now absent from the faces of the men. They nodded as Mr. Becker spoke, ready to march into battle. Adolf's gauze-covered face looked in awe as another nightmare was launching. Be the one to find her, Mr. Becker charged. With that, all but the 6 men in the transport team walked back down the trail to meet Agnes and search for Freda. The space between Mr. Becker and Adolf emptied of bodies, and Mr. Becker caught a glimpse of Adolf's fearful gaze. He stepped toward Adolf. Adolf, seeing Mr. Becker approaching, pocketed his expression. Are you ready? Mr. Becker asked, motioning toward the carriage. Adolf nodded, and the two stepped toward the carriage, embarking on a journey to bring Adolf's piano to its new home at Steinberg. With the path smoothed, the carriage could proceed at a healthy pace, still cautious due to its cargo, but much faster than the men walking down the path to join Agnes. They parted to let the carriage move through, and Adolf, sitting in the rear with his piano, watched out the back as they converged again in the wake of the carriage. Mr. Becker sat across from him, also watching his men as they faded into the path's horizon. Then, something vibrant blue in the woods caught Adolf's eye. It was just off the path behind Mr. Becker's side of the carriage. Mr. Becker noticed his intent focus and craned his neck to see what Adolf had spotted. He also saw the blue, and although it wasn't clear through the brush, he knew it was Agnes. He turned back to Adolf, nodded, motioned to the vibrant blue mystery, and said, Agnes, let us hope they can find something. Mr. Becker then looked back down the path, watching as the piles of brush and limbs passed by. Adolf's fear returned. but he was determined to hide it, so he too looked down the path. What will happen if they find her, he thought, letting the hypothetical actions play out in his head. Wolves didn't take her. She wasn't lost. She was buried deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees and leaves, but Adolf's cabin was the closest landmark to her grave. He would become the prime suspect in her death. He swallowed a lump in his throat, realizing that, even if he succeeded in rendering the Alp powerless, he would still have to answer for Freda's death. He pondered on this as the carriage traveled down the trail toward the road, and as they turned onto the road to head toward Steinberg, he shifted his focus. Spending time and energy worrying about what might happen after he defeats the Alp was futile. He needed a plan to defeat the Alp first. It had to be brilliant. It had to be unexpected. It had to be something his mother, or the Alp pretending to be his mother, would not anticipate. The piano arrived safely at Steinberg and was now resting in a new home, one much more worthy of its grandeur. The showcase room at Steinberg was built specifically for occasions like Friday's event. It was lined with wooden panels, thick wine-red curtains, and lanterns. A single skylight above the center of the room set the stage and beamed light onto Adolf's piano. Adolf and Mr. Becker stood and quietly reflected on the piano's beauty. The soft diffusion of the skylight brought out even more of the piano's intricate details and curves. Adolf felt proud of what he had built for the first time since this nightmare had begun. He saw its beauty. He felt the gravity of its rarity. "We'll finish up setting up the room tomorrow with chairs, and I'm sure you'll want to tune your piano after that journey." Mr. Becker broke the silence. He looked tired. It was getting late, and the skylight faded as the sunset progressed. Adolf's young assistant, Otto, entered the room holding a stack of blankets and a pillow. "Ah, thank you, Otto." Mr. Becker reached and accepted the stack of bedding, then looked to Adolf. "Under the piano, I assume?" Adolf nodded, and Mr. Becker walked to the piano to lay Adolf's bedding in place. While he unfolded the blankets and prepared a spot for Adolf that was at least familiar to him, he turned his head toward Adolf with another thought. "You'll need a suit," he said, almost surprised that he hadn't thought of it sooner. "I'll have my tailor come tomorrow morning and prepare something for you." Mr. Becker rose and motioned to the completed pallet bed under the piano, motioning to it and looking to Adolf for approval. Adolf nodded in thanks, and Mr. Becker walked toward the door. "Get some rest tonight, Adolf," Mr. Becker offered. "You've earned it, and you're going to need it." He placed a hand on Adolf's shoulder, squeezing it, and stepped out of the door, leaving Adolf alone in the ceremonial scene with his piano and a makeshift bed. Adolf looked at the bedding as he stepped toward it. Tonight would be the only night he would sleep without visiting the void, without seeing his mother, the mare, the Alp. It was almost too good to be true. Even though he knew that a treacherous journey awaited him on the other side of this slumber, he didn't care. He crawled underneath the piano, into the blankets, drifting off within minutes. As the skylight's beam dimmed to nothing, the room faded to black, and Adolf finally slept. Thursday began with the full force of Mr. Becker's determination. Steinberg was bustling with activity and commotion as teams of men prepared the showcase room for performance, the production floor for inspection, and to rejoin the search party with Agnes. Mr. Becker marched from one group to another, delivering their marching orders for the day. After deploying all but the search party team, he finally approached them and was joined by another man who was not part of the Steinberg crew. "Men," Mr. Becker barked to get their attention, "this is Eric. He and his dogs will be joining you today in the search." Eric was a hardened-looking older man. He had a stern, weathered face that did not react. His arms were folded. His boots were dirty. He was prepared for this mission. "Eric will split you up. We need to cover as much ground as possible today." Mr. Becker looked them each in the eyes to convey the importance of his words as he spoke. "Good luck." With that, he reached out and shook Eric's hand as the gang of men joining the search party filed out the door. Mr. Becker then turned toward the showcase room, where Adolf was tinkering with his piano. As Mr. Becker passed through the doorway, he saw that Adolf had been working for quite some time already. Parts were strewn about the area around the piano, and Adolf was leaning over inside the piano's body, performing adjustments for tuning. Mr. Becker looked at the parts on the ground, confused. The piano appeared to be intact. What did these parts belong to? He then looked back to Adolf, who had not yet noticed that he was standing there. The last time Adolf was leaned over inside of a piano, he had a terrible accident. Mr. Becker didn't want to startle him and risk a repeat of that nightmare, so he decided to wait patiently. After a few seconds, Mr. Becker's tailor entered the doorway and signaled to Mr. Becker, who raised his hand in acknowledgement. He now had no choice but to interrupt Adolf. Mr. Becker slowly stepped toward Adolf and the piano, leaned forward, and softly said, "Excuse me, Adolf," with bated breath as he waited for a response. Adolf carefully backed out of the piano and stood straight, facing Mr. Becker. Mr. Becker couldn't believe his eyes. Adolf's bandages were gone, and although the marks on his face were still present, they had healed tremendously in the few short days since the incident. On top of that, Adolf looked rested. He looked like a different man than the Adolf he had seen for the past few days. After realizing that he had been frozen in shock for several seconds, Mr. Becker looked to the tailor, motioning him to come forward. "Adolf, if we can interrupt you for a moment, Carl will take your measurements, and he'll be working on your suit for tomorrow," Mr. Becker explained. Adolf nodded and laid down his tools. He hadn't rested that well in so long that he woke up early and had already accomplished most of his tasks for the day. He needed to work ahead to clear his mind because he still had to figure out his primary mission, breaking the Alps' power. Carl began setting up his workspace to take Adolf's measurements, and Mr. Becker charged his stride out of the room toward his next mission. "I'll return shortly," he announced to Adolf and Carl. Adolf watched as he walked out of the room, then looked down to Carl, the tailor, who was already starting measurements of Adolf's lower half. He hadn't been measured since he was a young boy, and he had forgotten how uncomfortable it made him. He felt like a puppet, a statue, unless the puppeteer, the tailor, manipulated an arm or other part. Determined to avoid making eye contact with Carl, he looked at the only things in his direct line of sight, his piano and his tools. Adolf was very particular with how he kept his tools. He had a weathered leather roll that he had used to keep his tools organized for years, and although the tuning hammer, mutes, and tuning fork were out of their assigned spaces because they were in use, all of his other tools were nestled into their assigned pouches. One tool, in particular, held his gaze. It was called a Siever's voicing tool. It was a tool used to adjust the sound of the piano hammers and was a flat-headed holder of 6 needles. The needles picked at the hammer's felt to adjust the resulting tone. On the Steinberg production floor, they simply called it the felt picker. It was a petite and plain-looking tool. There was nothing remarkable about it, but he couldn't look away from it for some reason. Even after Carl began taking measurements of his upper half and moved his arms around in puppet fashion, Adolf continued staring at the felt picker, lost in its simplicity. On the side of the road near the mouth of the trail to Adolf's cabin, Agnes paced as she waited for the rest of her search party to arrive. Yesterday's search hadn't revealed any sign of Freda, but these woods were vast, and there was still a lot of ground to cover. She looked down the road into Heisenberg for a sign of anyone. Nothing. She turned and continued pacing in a pattern that she was sure to wear into the ground if she kept going much longer. She stared at her feet as she paced from point to point, looking to the woods or the road as she turned on her repetitive march. Mr. Becker had told her that he would be sending 20 men and a friend who raised hounds to join the search party today. She was glad to have reinforcements. The weight of Freda's disappearance was crushing. She had been gone nearly a week. Any hope that she was still alive was all but snuffed out in Agnes's mind. That didn't matter anymore. She still had to find her. She had to know. A faint sound caught her attention. Hooves, wagon wheels. The cavalry was approaching. She swung her gaze toward the sound and saw the growing shape of Steinberg's horse-drawn cargo carriage moving closer. The morning sun strobed through the near-barren trees to illuminate the carriage intermittently, revealing a larger image with every stride, wheel revolution, gallop, and burst of light. She stopped pacing and awaited the carriage's arrival at the mouth of the trail. As it stopped on the road next to her, men poured out of the covered cargo wagon, more than Agnes had expected. As an army built around her, she swelled with gratitude. Eric, with 4 large Münsterlinde hounds, parted the crowd as he moved toward Agnes. Their eyes met as he approached her, and she nodded in appreciation to Eric and then to the hounds. She looked around her, surrounded by 21 men and 4 hounds, and cleared her throat as she prepared to address the party. She spotted a small stump, freshly created by some of these same men during the clearing of the path, and stepped toward it, climbing up on it to see the lot of them at once. "Thank you for being here." She turned while speaking to be sure and address each and every man present. "Mr. Becker asked for volunteers, and you answered that call. I know you wouldn't be here if you didn't care for my sister. She connected her gaze with alternating members of the crowd, delivering her sincere thanks directly to the front steps of their souls. Freda has been missing nearly a week. Agnes hung her head as speaking those words into reality collided with her heart. Tears welled in her eyes. She did not wipe them away. Instead, she looked back to the men of the search party, unashamed of her emotion. "Let's bring her home," she closed, stepping down from the stump and walking toward Eric. 4 groups of 5, Eric barked to the men. 2 groups on each side of the trail, 1 shallow, 1 deep. Fan out. Hold your lines. Stay within shouting distance. Eric continued delivering his orders as the men segregated themselves into groups. Agnes waited patiently, allowing Eric to lead the charge for today's search and awaiting her orders. Eric looked to Agnes as the men began to move toward the trail. "You're with me, and I'm with them." He nodded toward the hounds. Agnes nodded in understanding and pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, extending it toward Eric. "Freda's," she explained. Eric nodded and accepted the bit of ornate cloth. He would use it to give his hounds Freda's scent, and they would, hopefully, lead them to her somewhere in these never-ending woods. "One more thing," he barked loudly to the men, many of whom were already headed down the path. "Those willing will camp tonight and start again at first light tomorrow. We'll be headed deep into these woods." He looked toward Agnes, conveying his commitment to the search and checking her willingness to do the same. She nodded. This was her only mission, and she would do whatever it took. Adolf placed his tuning tools back into their proper pouches with great care. Once released from the tailor's puppeteering, he was able to return to and complete his tuning. Normally, he would treat the area around the piano as his workspace, but this space was much different. The ceremonious lighting, the wine-red curtains, the dozen chairs now facing the piano. This was not a workspace. This was a stage. He had to take great care in cleaning up his mess, including picking up the parts that were strewn about, the parts that had confused Mr. Becker when he laid eyes on them. These were the remnants of the 4th pedal. Adolf had dismantled the pedal first thing that morning, disconnecting the trigger that tapped into the piano's abilities. It could no longer steal souls with its song. Adolf had no intention of taking 12 souls on Friday. He now had a plan to defeat the Alp. "Just gorgeous," Mr. Becker proclaimed as he burst through the doorway again, seeing the full glory of Adolf's piano with the skylights beamed now at maximum intensity, the room now fully set up, and Adolf's work area cleaned up. He continued walking toward Adolf and the piano, looking around the room and taking in the full scene with a smile of satisfaction. "First thing tomorrow, I'll be by to pick you up." He turned to Adolf and was back to talking business. Adolf's face was perplexed at the need to go anywhere, since the performance would be here in this room. "You can get cleaned up and put your new suit on at the tailor's," Mr. Becker explained. Adolf hadn't cleaned himself in a while, and it was obvious. This wasn't shocking to Adolf, but he simply hadn't given it thought over the past week. He wasn't embarrassed, but he agreed that he would need to freshen up, so he sheepishly nodded in response to Mr. Becker's plan. Mr. Becker smiled and nodded in understanding, then turned back to the doorway, stepping toward his next mission. He stopped just before turning back to Adolf. "Adolf," he said. Adolf, now tying up his leather tool roll, looked up to Mr. Becker. "Get some rest tonight." Mr. Becker smiled before turning away again and marching out of the showroom. Adolf looked down at the leather roll in his hand, walked toward the side of the room where his tools could be hidden, and placed the roll down gently. As he returned to the piano, his felt picker, the tool that had earlier caught his gaze, was no longer in its assigned pouch. It remained there on the piano keys, alone, left behind. With the ground of the trail disrupted by the path-clearing team, the hounds, pulling Eric and Agnes behind them, were at a disadvantage. They continued down the trail, flanked by wings of men who searched the ground, all desperate to find a sign of Freda. They reached the remains of yesterday's fire, and the hounds gravitated toward Adolf's cabin. Agnes watched their interest in the cabin increase as they drew nearer, but she realized this wouldn't reveal any new information. Freda had been to Adolf's cabin on Thursday. She delivered the note. The hounds sniffed around the cabin's closed door, then walked around the cabin, out of view from Eric and Agnes. Both expected to see them round the visible corner of the other side of the cabin as they orbited it, but they didn't appear. They had vanished. Agnes looked to Eric, who continued watching the cabin intently while walking toward it. Still no sign of them. Eric looked back to Agnes with concern and quickened his pace toward the cabin. Agnes quickened behind him. As Eric rounded the corner where they had last seen the hounds, he was surprised to see a large piece of the cabin's wall lying on the ground. The cabin was open from the side, and the hounds were inside the cabin. None of the hounds had opened, the initial cry to sign that they had found something, but they were studying the interior of the cabin thoroughly. Agnes caught up to Eric and saw the dogs inside the cabin. Confusion grew on her face. The dogs showed particular interest in the chair, the only piece of furniture in the tiny, now empty cabin. Agnes looked around in confusion. She had sat in that chair. Perhaps the dogs confused her scent for Freda's. Eric inspected the chair closely, wiping his hand on a residue collected on the chair leg brace, and bringing his hand up to his eyes and nose for closer examination. He rubbed the residue between his fingers, then looked to Agnes and said, "Ash." Her brow furrowed with further confusion. How was ash on the chair? She looked back at the burnt ground they had passed on their way to the cabin and realized that the chair must have been near the fire yesterday, but had been returned to the cabin before the team left. She was correct. Mr. Becker, ever the gracious house guest, had returned the chair himself. That still didn't explain Freda's scent on the chair, but Freda wasn't there now. They needed to press on. And if the hounds picked up her scent here at the cabin, maybe they could follow it from the cabin to wherever she went next. Eric and Agnes were both thinking this, and without speaking a word, looked at each other with mutual understanding of their next move. Eric called the hounds out of the cabin and led them across the ground surrounding the cabin. At the rear of the cabin, the hounds stopped and stood facing the woods behind it, sniffing the air. Adolf had wrapped Freda's body in a canvas and carried her through the woods. The hounds would not find her scent on the ground. Any branches that had grazed her body as Adolf carried her would have only touched the canvas that shrouded her now burial robes. If the hounds were going to catch any scent, it would have to be through canvas, several feet of dirt, and leaves deep within these woods. Even with Eric's hounds, the chances of finding Freda were meager. The hounds stepped forward into the forest and began searching the ground aimlessly. Agnes looked at Eric, whose already stern face was now peppered with disappointment. There was no clear trace of Freda. The cabin was a dead end. Agnes looked to the ground in shared disappointment, but she and Eric both stepped forward into the forest, following their hounds as they wandered deeper into the wooded abyss. The previously bustling scene at Steinberg was fading as the end of the workday neared. The production floor was pristinely cleaned and organized. The showcase room's ceremonious beam was less intense as the sun neared the horizon, but the room was still glowing with majesty. Off to the side, Adolf sat in one of the audience chairs. He was looking down at his hands, which now held the felt picker tool. He gripped it tightly with his right hand, pressing the needles into the palm of his left hand to test their sharpness, then released his grip and let the tool lay in his open palms. He continued to examine it, not looking up. "We'll be closing up soon," Mr. Becker announced to Adolf as he leaned his head into the doorway. Adolf looked up from his tool to Mr. Becker, forcing a grin and a nod. "Get some rest. Big day tomorrow." Mr. Becker leaned back out of the doorway and disappeared. Adolf looked down at the tool in his hands once more, then looked up to his piano and took a long, deep breath, lowering his chin as he exhaled and assumed the posture of determination. He wasn't nervous about tomorrow's performance. His only focus was tonight's battle with the Alp. Darkness had fallen on the woods, and the search party had made camp for the night. The 20 men, 4 hounds, Eric, and Agnes all settled in around a large fire. Mr. Becker had sent enough provisions with the men to provide basic comforts, food, coffee, blankets. Today's search did not lead to Freda, but Agnes was determined not to let disappointment rule this night. She asked the men to hear stories of their interactions with Freda. "I've heard several of your names mentioned," she announced, looking around at the men who were getting comfortable around the fire. "I know that several of you, have felt the sharp end of her wit on more than one occasion." She smiled as she looked them each in the eyes. "Please, I'd love to hear any lighthearted stories you might have about her," she pled through her lingering smile. She continued scanning their faces during the next several seconds of silence, the crackling fire popping loudly in the absence of any speak. "Oh, I have one," a gruff voice boasted from the back of the crowd. Agnes leaned for a better view of the speaker, who stood once he realized she couldn't see him. It was Hans, one of the larger, more brute workers at Steinberg. He was built and often acted a bit like a bear. He removed his hat and held it in his hand as he looked at Agnes, the fire's light reflecting on the bald skin on top of his head. "Freda always teased me about being weak," he chuckled. Agnes couldn't help but look surprised, given his size. The other men just nodded, knowing exactly what Hans was referring to. She would ask me to pick up something too heavy, mind you, then act disappointed when I'd said I couldn't, Hans recalled. Agnes and the men chuckled. She would call me the bear, and when we had to use horses to move heavy things, she would say, Hans chuckled again, then scrunched his face to raise his pitch to imitate Freda. The horse is mightier than the bear, huh? The men burst with laughter. Agnes shook her head while smiling. She could easily envision Freda saying that. That's disappointing, bear, Hans quoted Freda, breaking after the words left his mouth as tears formed in his eyes. Agnes felt great compassion for this big bear of a man. The men hung their heads, hiding the emotion that moved through the crowd like a wave, originating from Hans. Thank you, Agnes said, tenderly, as her eyes welled up too. I've got one too. Another man sprang up to his feet, eager to lighten the mood. Agnes turned to him and smiled. Man after man gave their recounts of Freda's wit and humor. They laughed, they smiled, they cried, and after hours of exchanging memories, they began to settle in for a night of sleeping under the stars. Agnes walked up to Eric, who was not part of the story exchange, but had been looking on to it, sitting with his hounds and keeping watch. Will you be sleeping tonight? Agnes asked Eric. Eric looked around at the men and then back to Agnes. We'll be keeping watch shifts, he explained. I'll be the first watch, and I'll rouse one of them when I need to retire, he said, motioning to the men. Agnes nodded in understanding, turned around, and approached her designated bed for the night, a blanket on top of a leaf-covered ground near the fire. She doubted that she could actually sleep, but she would need rest for another search tomorrow morning, and the sun would be here sooner rather than later. As she neared her blanket, the hounds roused and growled, startled by something in the darkness of the woods. Each slowly arose to his feet, peering into the darkness to get a look at whatever had spooked them. After less than 2 minutes, the hounds had relaxed. Whatever was out there had moved on, away from the group. Wolves? Agnes wondered, staring into the blanket of darkness long after the hounds and Eric were no longer on alert. Finally convinced it was another dead end, she lay down on the blanket, her face lit by the flickering flames, and closed her eyes. Eric sat on the ground and leaned against a tree, continuing his watch while the men and Agnes rested under the towering trees and stars beyond them. At first light, the wheels of progress were set in motion. Mr. Becker climbed into his carriage and set off toward Steinberg to fetch Adolf. He was visibly excited. This was a big day for Steinberg, for him, for Adolf, and in his bones he believed that this was big for the entire piano industry. He was to be a proud part of history on this day. It was more than a chore to fetch Adolf that he set out on that morning. It was the beginning of his destiny's birthday. Agnes and her search party packed camp and prepared to push the search deeper into the woods. The blankets were rolled up, the provisions packed, and the fire snuffed out. Agnes hadn't been this dirty since she was a young girl. She combed the leaves from her hair with her fingers and wiped the dirt from her face with her handkerchief, a twin to Freda's. She didn't care what she looked like, but she didn't want to feel dirty because the feeling was a distraction, and she needed 100% of her focus on the search. Ready? Eric asked, flanked by his hounds. Agnes pocketed her handkerchief and nodded. Eric waved a hand at the men, who had already formed their ranks and were just waiting for the signal to move. As they set off, the group transformed from a cluster into 2 wings extending from Agnes, Eric, and the hounds. The doors to Steinberg rattled and then flew open, flooding the dark entryway with light. Mr. Becker's silhouette stepped through the doorway, and he marched in with great enthusiasm. With his hands still in his coat pockets, he took large strides toward the showcase room, eager to get Adolf out the door and to the tailor. As he stepped through the doorway to the showcase room, the faint morning light fueled the skylight just enough to dramatically light the piano in an otherwise pitch-black room. The overhead light on the piano cast a dark shadow underneath it where Adolf was sleeping, but Mr. Becker could make out the lumpy shape of blankets. He was surprised that Adolf wasn't already awake and had his bedding put away for the day. "It's time to go," Mr. Becker announced, continuing his stride toward Adolf and the piano. No answer. "Adolf!" Mr. Becker barked, but still no answer. As he reached the piano, he bent down to Adolf's bedding and extended his hand to shake him awake. But his hand didn't meet with Adolf's back as Mr. Becker had expected it to. He reached for the ground underneath the piano, thinking perhaps Adolf was lying flat. But his hand was met with only a wadded-up blanket and something wet. Mr. Becker's face was fraught with confusion as he continued grasping, but he only found more damp blanket. Where was Adolf? What was this wet substance? He pulled his hand back and arose, moving his hand into the skylight's beam to examine the liquid still on his fingers. It was red, and it dried to attack quickly on his skin. This was blood. Mr. Becker's heart sank. He jumped to the side of the room to grab a lantern, clumsily lighting it and bringing it back underneath the piano. The lantern illuminated a mess of blood on the blanket and ground, but no sign of Adolf. Mr. Becker gasped and brought his bloodied hand to his mouth in horror. He leaned back, leaving the lantern on the ground to illuminate the bloody scene. "Mr. Becker?" A voice from a silhouette in the doorway called out. "Adolf?" Mr. Becker swung his attention to the doorway. The shadowy figure paused before responding. "No, sir, it's Otto, sir." Mr. Becker deflated. "Sir?" Otto sheepishly questioned. "There's a trail of blood leading out the back door," Otto explained, his voice quivering in fear. Mr. Becker sprang to his feet and looked to Otto, then to the bloody scene under the piano. Otto followed Mr. Becker's gaze to the lantern-lit, blood-soaked blanket, and his eyes grew with increasing terror. What happened to Adolf, sir?" Otto stammered in shock. Mr. Becker looked at Otto with glistening eyes. "Adolf is missing." The two held each other's gaze and shared a momentary bond of trauma before Mr. Becker realized that he needed to take action. He had to lead, no matter how frightful the circumstances. He began to pace and take deep breaths while his chaotic mind tried to formulate a plan. Adolf was missing, but there was a trail to follow. The critics would be arriving in just a few hours. This bloody mess had to be cleaned up before they arrived. 20 of his men, plus Agnes and Eric, had camped out and would still be in the woods. If they had found something yesterday, he would know by now. They would be resuming their search and pushing deeper into the woods. After a full minute of pacing, Mr. Becker stopped. "Otto," he began, "focus on cleaning this up." Otto, who had been standing frozen and bewildered, staring at Mr. Becker as he paced, gulped and reluctantly nodded as his eyes returned to the bloody mess. Mr. Becker stepped toward the doorway. "I'll find Adolf." He looked toward the ground as he stepped through the doorway and into the brighter light of the production floor, seeing the blood trail that Otto had mentioned. He had been so focused on his mission when he arrived this morning that he hadn't noticed the blood on the floor. He could see now that the trail exited the showcase room and headed straight to the back door, in the middle of the building's opposite end. He followed the trail to Adolf's workstation on the production floor. Adolf must have grabbed something to slow the bleeding because the blood spatters exiting the station were far less frequent. He followed the now thinner trail to the back door, and as he reached for the handle, he saw that it was smeared with blood too. He carefully reached out and grabbed the handle, not caring about getting more blood on his already covered hand. The door swung freely open. It had been unlocked and not returned to a fully closed position. Mr. Becker leaned out of the open doorway, and his eyes followed the blood-stained bits on the ground as they led to the back side of the building. He stepped out of the building and followed the trail leading past the building and to the road. Mr. Becker stopped as he reached the road and looked down it in the direction that the trail turned. It was the direction of Adolf's cabin. He exhaled in defeat. There was no sign of Adolf on the road as far as he could see, and the trail would become difficult to follow. He needed Eric and his hounds. The search party would be deep into the forest now, and reaching them with word would take hours. He also still had guests coming and was responsible for today's event. More men would be arriving at Steinberg now, and he could direct them to assist Otto with cleanup and preparation. As he turned back to the building, he looked down to see blood staining his pants, his coat, and his shirt. He held up his bloody hand and turned it over. He had to get cleaned up too. He lowered his hand and set stride toward the front entrance. He would assign most men to assist Otto, but one man would set out on horse to tell Eric that he was needed back in town. Redirecting Eric would severely weaken the search party, but the men would remain with Agnes. Only Eric and the hounds would change course. A blood trail is the kind of thing Eric's hounds could track down quickly, while they may not be on any kind of a trail on their current search. It was the strategic move that made the most sense to Mr. Becker's business mind. He swung open the doors to Steinberg and was met with a group of 10 men who had arrived for the workday. They had seen the blood trail in the building and Otto cleaning up the showcase room. They were confused, and seeing Mr. Becker covered in blood pushed them beyond confusion into fear. Mr. Becker looked around at each of their shocked faces and raised his hands to calm them, not realizing that his blood-covered hands only fueled their fright. He looked at his hands, now realizing his error, lowered them, and announced, "Adolf is missing. and he's clearly injured badly. He grabbed a rag from the shelf near the doorway and began wiping the blood off of his hands. I followed the trail to the road. We need Eric's hounds. He looked through the crowd of men while he continued wiping the blood from his hands. Who can get word to Eric the fastest? One of the men raised his hand, and Mr. Becker quickly nodded to him. Go, time is our enemy. The volunteer rushed out the door to fetch his horse and raced to the search party to deliver the word. Mr. Becker looked to the remaining men. Everyone else, I'm sorry, but we must clean this up before our guests arrive. They looked at each other and nodded with the same reluctant understanding that Mr. Becker expressed, and then they disbanded and began grabbing supplies to erase the trail of blood from Steinberg. Mr. Becker turned around and exited Steinberg, walking back to his carriage with a cleanup mission of his own. The search party was pressing deep into the woods now, far past any sign or path of civilization. It was a vast sea of leaves with a labyrinth of trees that forced the party to twist and turn their way forward. They trudged on through the thick leaves that blanketed the ground, and though the day was early, Agnes felt like their chances of finding anything out here were dwindling. She spotted something up ahead, a small clearing. As they drew nearer, she could see something lying on the ground in that clearing. She looked to Eric, who had also spotted the object, and they quickened their pace. The hounds had already quickened their pace as well, picking up on the object's scent. Eric whistled to the men who flanked them and pointed to the clearing, and the line of men began to fold in toward it. The hounds reached the clearing first and opened with a cry. They had found something. Agnes followed, out of breath, and as she exited the labyrinth into the clearing, she saw that the object on the ground was a person. Although the person was face down, she could see that it was a man and that he was covered in blood. Beside the man, the leaves had been pushed out of the way to reveal a large spot of freshly disturbed earth. Eric and the men arrived. Eric motioned for the men to roll the man over to identify him. The men, confused because this was not Freda's body, hesitantly stepped forward and rolled the body over to its side. It was Adolf. The wounds on his face had reopened, and his clothing had been slashed all over his chest and arms. He had been viciously attacked by something. Not wolves, Eric observed. Agnes looked at him with confusion. Eric looked from Adolf's body to Agnes to dispel her visible confusion. The body's still here, he explained. The men shook their heads in disappointment at the scene. A few of them rolled Adolf's body to its back and prepared to roll it up in blankets for transport when one noticed the patch of disturbed earth beside the body. It was the size of a large grave. He looked at the other men and shouted with outstretched hand, "Shovel!" One of the men handed a shovel forward, and several others grabbed their shovels to join in. They had to dig up whatever was buried there. It might help explain what happened to Adolf. The sound of a gallop through leaves approached the group. Eric and Agnes turned around to see a man on horseback speeding toward them, winding through the labyrinth of trees. They walked toward the edge of the clearing where the man and horse would enter and awaited an explanation of his hasty visit. He slowed his horse as he entered the clearing but did not waste time dismounting, leaning down to speak to Eric directly. "Mr. Becker needs you and your hounds," he panted, out of breath from the ride. "It's Adolf. He's—" Before he could finish the words, the scene in the clearing caught his eye. He saw the men digging, and beside them, he saw Adolf's body. Adolf wasn't missing any longer. He was here. He was gone. Back at Steinberg, Mr. Becker sat at Adolf's piano, performing for the critics seated around the showcase room who were in awe of the piano's aesthetic beauty and lush sound. Mr. Becker was a formidable pianist in his own right, but his real passion was for the craft of creating the piano. This was his first time playing this piano, Adolf's piano, and while he performed Bach's Goldberg variations, his mind was elsewhere, with Adolf and with Freda. As he reached the final aria, a tear fell down his cheek. As an audience member, it appeared that the piano's song so enraptured him that it had pulled the emotion from him, and while this piano was certainly capable of doing so, it was Adolf and Freda who fell this tear. As he closed Bach's variations, a thunderous applause shook the room as critics sprang to their feet. Mr. Becker slowly looked from the piano's keys to the audience, forcing a smile and a nod. As he stood from the piano, the critics mobbed him with questions and requests for orders. The showcase was an outstanding success. However, Mr. Becker spotted something in the back of the room. The doors had been swung open, and the man who had rode out this morning to deliver word to Eric was standing in the doorway, out of breath and looking utterly defeated. Mr. Becker's concern grew as he examined the man's demeanor. "Excuse me for a moment," he begged of his audience, stepping through the crowd to speak with his exhausted and visibly troubled man. As the man explained to Mr. Becker what was discovered in the woods, Mr. Becker's demeanor slumped. He hung his head, closed his eyes, and exhaled defeat. He looked back to the crowd and knew that he had to pull himself together to answer their questions, so he stood tall, recollected himself, and stepped back toward them. He forced himself to act as if everything was fine, fulfilling his duties as leader of Steinberg. But throughout it all, one question repeated in his mind. What happened to Adolf last night? Adolf was alone once more in the hallowed halls of Steinberg. Everything was pristinely prepared for the next day's event, except for his pallet bed on the floor underneath the piano. In the showcase room, the lanterns were dark, and the moonlight provided an eerie glow to Adolf's piano, as if the moon knew that Adolf was about to march into battle. Adolf stepped toward the piano, still clasping the felt picker tool, and knelt to crawl into his familiar bed once more. He didn't bother covering himself with a blanket. He laid flat on his back and folded his hands on his chest, pushing the tool's needle end into the cuff of his right sleeve and gripping the handle tightly with his right hand. He closed his eyes and began to take long, deep, controlled breaths. As he attempted coaxing his body to sleep, his mind resisted, racing with thoughts of Freda, Mr. Becker, Agnes, and his mother. He tried to quiet his mind, focusing on his breath, but repeatedly his mind was interrupted by a flash of the faces of those he cared for. His eyes and brows twitched as he continued fighting to quiet his mind. Suddenly, something changed. His eyes weren't open, but he could tell that he was in the dark void again. It sounded different, like a large empty room made of marble, where every tiny sound echoed infinitely. Footsteps approached slowly, echoing with increasing volume until they stopped near his feet. Adolf's eyes shot open, and he saw his mother standing at his feet, smiling at him. "How do you feel?" she asked, tilting her head and leaning toward him. Adolf forced himself to a sitting position, forced a smile, and responded, "Ready," with empty eyes. His mother was pleased to see this. He had locked away all of the emotion that would have surely interfered or caused hesitation as he headed into tomorrow's mission, taking 12 souls at once. Adolf pushed himself to his feet and faced his mother like a soldier ready to be commanded. She was even more impressed with his demeanor, looking him up and down and nodding in approval. "Do you feel rested after last night?" she asked. He gave a single nod in response, staring straight ahead while she began stepping in orbit around him, continuing her inspection. "This will be no easy task," she added while continuing her orbit. "It will take every bit of energy you have, and more." She returned to Adolf's front side and stopped to face him. "You will need to rest again tonight," she explained, her eyes accenting her words to show that this was a gift to Adolf. She would not be keeping him here tonight, but would let him return for rest and preparation for tomorrow. Adolf nodded in thanks but kept his stoic demeanor. "Adolf," she said his name tenderly, stretching out her right hand for him to accept. "I'm so proud of you." He looked down at her outstretched hand and then to her face, now conveying the tender emotion he yearned from his mother. His eyes began to glisten, and he brought his left hand up to meet with hers. She smiled at this and stretched out her other arm, inviting him in for an embrace. He hung his head as the glistening in his eyes turned to a flood, and he stepped toward her to accept the embrace. They held each other tightly. "My boy," she whispered. Adolf's eyes shot open as he felt the tickle of her cloak again, and he knew it was time to make his move. He reached his left hand up, grasping the cloak and her hair tightly, then pulled. Adolf's mother let out a shriek of pain, but before she could take any defensive action, Adolf slid the felt picker tool from his cuff and pressed it into her disfigured eye, the Alp's evil eye. "No!" she shrieked, but Adolf pressed the needles of the tool into her eyeball. As the needles entered the eye, blood shot out in several directions, covering Adolf's face and chest, but he kept his firm grasp on her hair to control her and kept the pressure of the felt picker tool on her eye. The void echoed with demonic screams. These were no longer the screams of his mother. As he moved his right hand to the handle of the tool to pluck the Alp's eye from its socket, his mother, blood-covered and wailing in demonic tones, raised her knee and kicked him away. Adolf fell to the ground, quickly scrambling back to his feet to finish the task, but his mother was gone. He began quickly scanning the darkness, but before he could spot her, the mare screamed from behind him, charging straight toward him. He jumped out of the way just before the mare reached him and watched as the mare flew by. It was now bloodied, and the tool was still pressed into its eye. The Alp had switched forms from Adolf's mother to the mare. The mare disappeared as quickly as it came, and another sound, a shrill shrieking hiss, flew at Adolf from the other direction. A small creature, fur and blood-covered, wearing the cloak and carrying the tool in its eye, charged Adolf and jumped onto him. Adolf yelled as the Alp slashed at him with its sharp claws while clinging to his chest. It slashed his face, reopening his striped wounds, and his chest, tearing through his clothes and drawing immediate blood. Adolf wanted to grab the tiny Alp and throw it, but he knew that he had to finish the job, so he wrapped his arms tightly around it with a forceful bear hug. The Alp let out a piercing scream, and Adolf quickly grasped the handle of the felt picker tool hanging from the Alp's eye. He pulled and twisted with all of his might until the Alp and the eye freed from each other. Adolf and the Alp fell to the ground in opposite directions, the Alp screaming with its hands to its face, and Adolf still holding the tool and the eye. Adolf was injured, bleeding profusely, but he pushed to his feet, staring at the flailing Alp with contempt. He dropped the tool and the eye to the ground, raised his foot, and stomped with all of his force. The Alp screamed louder, and the light that transported Adolf back home flooded in hurriedly, quickly blinding the scene. Adolf awoke under his piano. His heart was racing. He had done it. He had defeated the Alp and destroyed its power over his life, but he was bleeding profusely. He felt the wounds on his face and chest and quickly realized that he would not survive the night. He had already lost a great deal of blood, and these wounds were too severe to treat himself. He crawled out from under the piano and immediately knew what he had to do. He stumbled out of the showcase room and through the production floor to his old workstation, grabbing rags to slow his bleeding, then pressed on out of the back door, around the building, and to the road. In the darkness of night, he bled and stumbled down the side of the road out of Heisenberg until he reached the trail to his cabin. He pressed forward, coughing up blood, using the trees to help him stand until he came up to his cabin. He didn't stop there. Instead, he continued deeper into the woods. He stumbled through the leaves from tree to tree as his life force faded, but he was determined to reach his destination. He came up on a glow in the distance. It was the camp of Agnes and her search party. As he trudged through the leaves, he heard the hounds in the camp stir. He had captured their attention and the attention of Agnes. He watched as the hounds relaxed, but Agnes kept staring in his direction. She couldn't see him in the darkness, but he stared back at her. When it was safe to move, Adolf pressed on, maintaining a safe distance from camp. He was growing weaker by the second, and he wondered if he would reach his destination, but he was determined. This would be his final act. Failure was not an option. Finally, as the sunrise shot hints of light through the barren trees, he reached the clearing where he had buried Freda. He pushed the leaves that covered her grave to the side, ensuring that the search party would find her, and then he collapsed next to the grave. With his blood-covered chest on the ground, he turned his face toward Freda's grave and stretched out his hand to its turned dirt. Freda's body would be found, ensuring this was his final act, and while it did not undo any of the terrible things that had happened, Adolf needed her to be found. He slowly closed his eyes and released his final breath.